Hi, welcome back guys. This is your sensei, back with another fanfiction. This is the movie of What If Naruto and Sasuke Were Cousins and it's Sharingan. Now before starting, please give this video a like and subscribe to the channel if you want more videos like this. Now let's get into the fanfic. There have been stories of children, civilian and otherwise, finding that they had an unexpected Kekkei Genkai and learning that they had an ancestor from one of the clans that had wandered through the region of their birth before the founding of the shinobi villages. Most of the stories were disbelieved, though there were a few odd Hyuga who had never attended the academy and had seemingly cropped up out of nowhere. This is the story of one such child. Not one of the mystery Hyuga, a kid with a random Kekkei Genkai that he supposedly shouldn't have had. The story could arguably begin in the land of Wave when the Kekkei Genkai had seemingly randomly appeared, but it could also have been said to have started in two different places on the same day nearly 80 years before. One place was the main Uchiha encampment, the other was an inn several miles away. While the Uchiha all had houses somewhere, the clan was constantly in demand for missions and battles, which meant that they rarely if ever got to see said houses. Occasionally, they came home to discover that their houses had been looted down to the foundation while they were gone, and that just about everything, including things that had been nailed down, was missing. The Senju were usually to blame for this, and the favor was just as often returned as it was received. As soon as Uchiha was deemed old enough for travel, most of his or her year was spent living out of a bag in a tent, or just living out of a bag. Life in the camp wasn't all that bad though. There was a sizable band of people who made a living following the Uchiha around, providing goods and services for them in exchange for the pay their high quality demanded. They were willing to take this risk because the Uchiha were willing to protect their entertainment, so long as said entertainment didn't follow them somewhere where they ended up being an unnecessary distraction. Madara's decision to allow the strip show to come within a mile of the camp had been the best one he'd ever made as far as a good number of the men were concerned. Inside one of the tents clustered around the central water source that was a well this time, which everyone had agreed was a vast improvement over the slightly murky pond they'd last been clustered around. One Uchiha Hikaku was a him, busy with one of the camp followers. Uchiha Hikaku was a young man of fairly average height with the long face and pointed chin that was pretty much standard in the clan. He had dark brown hair which he kept up in a short ponytail, and eyes that were ink black when they weren't Sharingan red. He was strong and well regarded by his peers. Hikaku's current companion was a rather voluptuous blonde with brilliant blue eyes who claimed that her family name was Namikaze. Whether or not this was true was up for debate, as the camp followers tended to take up aliases on the road for various reasons. She hailed from parts unknown and had been following the Uchiha around for only a little while. She wasn't as pure as fresh-driven snow, nor was she one of those whores that even those who were too ugly to get a girl of their own were afraid to touch. That suited Hikaku just fine since he wasn't looking for a wife at the moment. While Hikaku was occupied with his companion, several young adolescents were experiencing the joys of a meal that didn't come out of a communal cooking pot half-burned at an inn several miles away, while their cousin and teacher was occupying himself with other things in a room upstairs. One of the first things Uchiha learned when he or she joined the clan in their travels for missions was that they were pretty much on their own for food because their fathers, and in some cases mothers, weren't going to cook for them any longer. Buying grub from the camp followers was expensive, and couldn't be done too regularly on the cut they received from the clan's pay. Hence their usual practice of pooling their resources and having the best cook in the group deal with the cooking. The current best cook of the current generation royally sucked, however. This part of the story isn't about the youngsters who were scarfing the food in front of them down as if they'd been starving for weeks, despite the fact that the adults in the clan made sure they were provided for in that area, even if it meant that they went without. It's about their teacher Uchiha Izuna, co-head of the Uchiha clan and brother to Uchiha Madara, whose spur-of-the-moment decision to take a woman who'd found him queued up on her proposition would have long-reaching consequences. While the children ate, Izuna kissed the sleeping woman who had shared his bed one last time before he got up to get dressed. He knew that he was going to get a talking to, or yelling at rather, from his brother over this. While the woman hadn't given her family name the evening before, it was as obvious as her long red hair. The Uzumaki were related to and allied with the Senju, therefore making it a strong possibility that the woman he'd met while herding the brats to some minor training mission was a spy, considering the fact that she hadn't tried to kill him the second he'd gotten close enough to kiss. The adrenaline high from the danger he'd known he had been in had been exquisite, and the yelling at he'd received from his highly protective brother didn't make it any less worth it. What was done, and what was done was fun. Izuna would later come to regret leaving the woman while she was asleep rather than waking her up to at least say goodbye. She stopped chasing him eventually, when she became too pregnant to run in fact, but the damage was done, and as far as he and Madara were concerned, if they ever heard the word Databeo again, it would be too soon. By that point, Izuna didn't care whether or not the child was actually his. He never wanted to see its mother or her brothers again, and if the kid was like any of them. While a certain Uzumaki was giving birth to a rather beautiful daughter with hair so dark red it was almost black and Inkai black eyes in the land of Whirlpool, a certain blonde was giving birth to a brown-haired son with Inkai black eyes in a place that would soon become part of the land of fire. Neither child would meet the other during their lifetimes, and neither child would show any sign of developing the Sharingan. Unlike the Byakugan, the gene that allowed the Uchiha to unlock their Kekkei Genkai was recessive. Izuna's daughter would grow up to be quite the beauty, and would gain one hell of a reputation on the battlefield where she brought glory to her family and the village of Uzumaki as a whole. Eventually, in due time, she settled down and married another Uzumaki. They ended up having a lovely daughter and several healthy sons, all with the standard Uzumaki features and dark eyes. The daughter would never show any signs of the Sharingan, though one of the girl's brothers would shortly before he died in battle. Ikaku's illegitimate son would move to Konoha as a child and grow up to be a reasonably handsome if rather average shinobi who would survive the first Shinobi War. He ended up settling down with a rather beautiful platinum blonde medic he'd met after becoming injured. They would have a blonde-haired, blue-eyed, dim and somewhat scatterbrained son who showed absolutely no signs of having the Sharingan. Neither Izuna's granddaughter nor Hikaku's grandson would meet. Izuna's granddaughter would marry another Uzumaki, and Hikaku's grandson would marry a rather pretty chunin with sun-blonde hair and blue eyes and nice assets, as Hikaku's preference for blondes had apparently been handed down the line for a time. It was Izuna's great-granddaughter and Hikaku's great-grandson who would meet. Neither Uzumaki Kushina nor her academy classmate turned boyfriend turned husband Namikaze Minato, Yondaime Hokage of Konoha, would have any inkling that they were related to the rather sizable Uchiha clan that also made its home in Konoha, as Minato's grandfather had considered the man who raised him to be his father and never said anything about the man who had sired him to his children. And Kushina's grandmother had only gotten a terse "he's dead" in reply to any questions she'd asked about her father. Neither Kushina nor Minato would show signs of having the Sharingan, though there would be some questions about exactly how Minato had been able to keep up with things when he was using the Hurricane to take down 50 to 100 opponents practically all at once. On the day Kushina and Minato's son Naruto was born, a man claiming to be Uchiha Madara attacked. While he was removing the Kyuubi from Kushina, he found himself wondering about a certain possibility after hearing the woman say databane like she always did, since he'd heard a number of interesting things when the real Madara was in a grumbly mood and inclined to ramble. While there may have been something of a resemblance about the eyes, the Uzumaki woman didn't look anything like Madara, and therefore consequently Madara's brother Izuna, and that annoying verbal tic was more than likely a common problem amongst the Uzumaki. 12 years later, on a bridge in the land of Wave, under a dome of ice mirrors, two boys suddenly found it much easier to track their exceedingly fast opponent. At one point, when Uchiha Sasuke had briefly looked his teammate in the eyes, he'd gotten the shock of his life when he'd found another pair of Sharingan looking back into his own. He managed to get out a surprised "what?" before several senbon temporarily took him down for the count. The night after the battle on the bridge, Sasuke stared at his teammate from his position on a futon in Izuna's home. He wondered if he'd imagined what he'd seen on the bridge before the fake hunter nin senbon had pierced him and rendered him unconscious, despite the fact that the Sharingan was supposed to see and record everything accurately as it took it in. That had to be the case. He had to have hallucinated or something. He couldn't even contemplate the other option. Naruto was not family. Not only was the dead last surname Uzumaki, but blonde Uchiha were almost completely unheard of. Brown was the dominant Uchiha hair color, with black coming in at a close second. The few blonde Uchiha in existence at the time of the massacre had a shade of hair that was closer to brown than platinum, or sun yellow like the dough had. Naruto bore almost no resemblance to the other members of his clan, though there was something about the shape of his eyes that was naggingly familiar. How could this this outsider have the Sharingan, and a natural one no less? It was frankly impossible. Finding out that their sensei had the Sharingan had been jarring enough. Kakashi had it in only one eye, however, and is looked to have been implanted. He had heard of such procedures, but had never encountered a person who'd had one before Kakashi. In contrast to Kakashi's, Naruto's Sharingan had appeared to be completely natural. How could Naruto have a natural Sharingan when he had blue eyes, though? Almost everyone in his clan who developed the Sharingan had eyes that were black, brown, or dark gray. He would have to shelve this problem for later when he had more resources at hand. There was no way he could solve it now, so far from Konoha and the clan records, that might shed some light on this unusual situation. This situation that he might have to deal with despite the fact that he didn't want to, since it was up to him to do so as the last of the Uchiha. Kakashi briefly wondered how Naruto had gotten the Sharingan, since he knew for a fact that Naruto was his sensei's son, as he had tested the boy himself using some of Minato sensei's hair that he'd kept when he'd grabbed his brush on the morning after the Kyuubi attack and discovered that his sensei had borrowed it again the day before. After a great deal of thought on the matter, Kakashi ended up deciding that the Sharingan was something that must have cropped up from his mother's line, since, if he remembered correctly, Kushina had what was commonly referred to in Konoha as the Uchiha Chin. The fact that the Uzumaki were allied to the Senju made them more prone to being on the receiving end of attacks from the Uchiha. And, if one of the Uzumaki women had survived a raid on their home and decided to keep the resulting offspring, Kushina had never mentioned being related to the Uchiha in all of the time he'd known her. But, considering the fact that a great deal of shinobi, even shinobi from great clans, couldn't accurately trace their families back more than 5 generations or so, unlike the samurai who could accurately trace their lineage back for centuries, it was entirely possible that Kushina-san hadn't known she had been When Kakashi got to Konoha with his little brother, Genin, and made his post-mission report, which he'd been ordered to do in person considering the fact that the mission had been far from ordinary, he saved the best bit for last. Sasuke has activated his Sharingan, he said once he'd finished summarizing the main events of the mission. The Hokage smiled at this, as did the council that consisted of the rest of the Hokage's former Genin team, the infamous Team Tobirama. Apparently, they'd been worried that Sasuke wouldn't develop his Sharingan, since such late activations were rare, and were relieved that it was not so. As his Naruto, he continued, casually lobbing that little bombshell onto the group. He was treated to the sight of the Hokage almost swallowing his lit pipe, and Koharu and Amira both looked like they were going to have heart attacks. I think I misheard you, Koharu said when she finally found her voice. You just said that Naruto had activated his Sharingan, he replied casually. Senju Tobirama's students all blinked at the same time and stared at him, revealing how eerily alike they were, as well as why the Hokage kept them around despite the fact that they constantly sided with Danzo. Kushina, Amira finally said, has to be. I ran the genetic comparison between that boy and his father 5 times. 5 times? Koharu asked, sounding like she hadn't quite believed her ears. Whether or not it was deserved, Kushina had a bit of a reputation, so naturally I had my doubts, Amira said with a shrug. But still, 5 times, Koharu said, her tone both cold and dangerous. Despite the free entertainment he was receiving, he decided to get the hell out of there. He'd seen one of the famous Team Tobirama arguments once before, and had no desire to ever see another one again. From the looks of things, Amira was going to step on the hidden trap, and the usually placid Koharu was going to explode. Sasuke choked on dust as he furiously flipped through the clan records which had been placed in storage following the massacre, frantically searching for the name Uzumaki. There was nothing in his generation or his parents' generation or his grandparents' generation for that matter. Eventually, after hours of searching clan lists and complicated genealogy charts that were created to arrange marriages so the clan didn't become too inbred, he finally found it. Underneath the names of Uchiha Izuna and some Uzumaki woman whose given name had been blotted out was possible child, sex unknown. There was a birth year for this child that was nearly 80 years prior. That had to be it. There was nothing else that could possibly fit. Since his mother was also of Izuna's line, this apparently made him and Naruto something along the lines of third cousins, which meant that Naruto was family. He had family. In his own apartment, Naruto stared in the bathroom mirror. It had taken a while, but he'd figured out how to activate that Sharingan thing on command. The Sharingan was the Uchiha clan's Kekkei Genkai thing. Did that make him a Uchiha? Did all of his family die when the Uchiha did? Had his parents been living in the Uchiha district avoiding him like all the Uchiha did all of his life before the massacre? The old man had told him that his parents had died on the day of the Kyuubi attack, but other people had said that his parents hadn't wanted him and that they were too ashamed to even be associated with him, which was why he never saw them. Who was right? The old man cared about him. Had the old man lied to him to protect his feelings? Lost in such musings, he finally realized how long it was he'd been staring in the mirror when the room outside his open bathroom door began to get dark. If he didn't hurry, he'd be late to meet Iruka-sensei, if he wasn't already. After quickly washing his face and hands since that was what he'd come in there for before he'd gotten distracted by his eyes again, he raced out of his apartment and down to Ikaraku Ramen. Iruka was sitting there waiting for him when he got there, and when he sat down, his former sensei joked that since he'd had his first C rank he should be treating him to ramen. No way, he yelled before he made his order. Iruka studied Naruto as he picked at his meal, still on the first bowl that he'd enthusiastically ordered before the enthusiasm started bleeding out of the boy and his eating slowed until he was just picking at his food. That was completely unlike the normally enthusiastic boy who would eat him out of house and home if he could. It was clear that there was a large problem on the boy's mind that was making him both worried and withdrawn. Considering the number of things that the boy had let roll off of him without looking the least bit concerned over the years, whatever was occupying his former student's attention was something major. What is it, Naruto? He asked as he watched the boy play with his ramen rather than eat it, which made even Chuchai, who'd had the boy's second bowl ready several minutes earlier, looking concerned. Iruka-sensei, do you know who my parents are? Naruto asked. No, he replied honestly. Beyond the fact that Naruto was in Uzumaki and that the Uzumaki were originally from Uzashigakure, he knew nothing about the boy's heritage. Why do you ask? The old man said that my parents died in the Kyuubi attack, but, Naruto said, leaving the sentence unfinished. Great, someone had been saying nasty things about Naruto's parents, again. Considering the fact that it had gotten to the boy who would smile at just about all insults this much, whatever had been said had to have been bad. If the Hokage said that they died in the Kyuubi attack, then that's when they died. Whoever told you otherwise was lying, he said, attempting to cheer the morose boy up. He'd been one of the camp that had believed that the Uzumaki boy's parents had abandoned him until the Hokage had flat out told him that they had died. He hadn't known exactly when they died, and learning they died during the Kyuubi attack was a surprise. It was truly ironic that the attack that had taken his parents had also taken Naruto's. It was even more ironic that the monster that had killed Naruto's parents was sealed within their son. What's got you thinking about your parents now? He asked, gently interrogating the boy in hopes of getting the name of the person to whom he was either going to give a severe beating or a good yelling. depending on their age. Naruto turned to him and blinked. When he opened his eyes, they were red. Sharingan red. Holy, how did your mission go? Sakura's mother asked her over dinner. Okay, Sakura replied. There were certain things about her mission and way that she couldn't share even with her parents. Did anything interesting happen? Sakura's mother asked. Both Sasuke and Naruto activated their Kekkei Genkai. Sakura replied, figuring that little detail was safe enough to share since it would be getting around the village soon. What is the Uzumaki boy's Kekkei Genkai? Her mother asked, sounding worried. The Sharingan, just like Sasuke. She replied. Her mother dropped her chopsticks and her father choked on his water. Using one of them was rather clever, considering. Her father eventually said after a long silence. SHH, we can't talk about that, dear. Her mother said, nodding in her direction and giving her father a significant look. The meal ended in silence. Sakura went up to her room afterward burning with curiosity about what it was that her parents couldn't talk about in front of her, and why it seemed to be related to Naruto of all people. Danzo picked up his evening report on any and all important happenings within the village with a small smile and started to read. 10 seconds later, he sprayed tea all over it. The morning following his meal with Iruka, Naruto went to his training with a slightly lighter heart. Only slightly lighter, due to the fact that he still had no clue who his parents were, and either way they were dead. Iruka had comforted him following his revelation that he'd had the Sharingan, and explained things to him the night before. As for why he was Uzumaki rather than Uchiha, Iruka had said that there had been a great deal of confusion in the aftermath of the Kyuubi attack when hundreds of new orphans had flooded the system all at once. It was entirely possible that someone had screwed up the paperwork somewhere when they were trying to tally the children and return those who had family to their relatives and send those who didn't to the orphanages, which were also swamped. Sasuke was already at the training grounds when he arrived, as was Sakura. Sasuke looked as if he hadn't gotten a wink of sleep the night before, and it clearly hadn't improved his mood. Considering the fact that he was actually snapping at Sakura rather than sitting there and silently ignoring her pawing and constant Sasuke-kun this, Sasuke-kun that, why don't we go on a date, Sasuke-kun? Sasuke-kun, Sasuke-kun, Sasuke-kun. Sasuke was the first to notice his presence and looked up at him. Oddly enough, the other boy wasn't giving him that look of cold dismissal he usually gave him. That look that stated that he was not worth his regard because he was so far beneath him it wasn't even funny that he gave him all the time. Instead, Sasuke looked nervous. It took me a while, but I think I figured out how we're related, Sasuke said when he finally reached his teammates. Really? He asked. The old man hadn't been able to tell him who his parents were, only that they'd died the day he was born. A lot of people had died the day of the Kyuubi attack, and many were still unidentified. He'd always thought it was possible that his real parents were amongst those who still lay unclaimed. When he'd first asked about his parents, the old man had told him that he'd been found next to the body of a woman named Uzumaki who had recently given birth. It was entirely possible that his mother had asked the Uzumaki woman to evacuate him during the confusion, and the Uzumaki woman hadn't made it. If the Uzumaki woman had recently given birth, he could have naturally been mistaken for her baby. I believe that you're my third cousin through Uchiha Izuna, Sasuke said as he pulled out an old scroll and unfurled it. He then pointed to a spot on the scroll. Why don't they know what the baby is or have a name for it? He asked as he looked at the spot where the Izuna guy's name was next to that of an Uzumaki. The person I believe to be your great-great-grandmother went back to her homeland before the child was born, Sasuke said. The clan was unable to keep track of her after that. So I really am an Uzumaki, he said. That was a relief. He'd spent the night afraid that he'd been running around with someone else's name. He'd even had a nightmare where the real baby of the Uzumaki woman he'd been found next to had come and demanded that he give him his name back. The Uzumaki woman he'd been found next to really had been his mother, though that left the question of why he'd been found next to her if the Yondaime had sealed the Kyuubi inside him. Maybe she'd been there to watch it happen, to make sure he didn't die, and got killed by a stray swipe from the Kyuubi. As for how he had the Sharingan thing, he just had the same great-grandpa or whatever as Sasuke, and got it from him. Yes, and you're also a Uchiha, Sasuke said, cutting through his musings. There was an odd look in the boy's eyes when he said it. It reminded him of the feeling he had when he watched other children go home with their parents while he was left out all alone to look after himself. Okay, he said as he settled into the spot he usually sat in while waiting for Kakashi. He didn't know what else to say. It was strange. The whole situation was strange. He had family, and that family was Sasuke of all people. I found a picture of a cousin of ours that you resemble somewhat, Sasuke said as he refurled the scroll they'd been looking at and put it away. Really? He asked. Sasuke pulled out the photograph of his mother's younger cousin who died before he and Naruto were born. There was a strange tight, almost painful feeling in his chest as he did so. Naruto hadn't rejected him like he'd feared he would. He'd gotten maybe 2 hours of sleep before he'd come here, and in those 2 hours he'd had a dream in which Naruto had firmly rejected him because of how he'd treated him over the years, and had told him exactly where he could shove the Uchiha clan and how. He'd been rather tactful when mentioning Naruto's ancestor. He'd found Uchiha Izuna's journals in the clan archives after he'd discovered his link to Naruto. And Naruto's great-great-grandmother had been described as a howling witch who had chased their great-great-grandfather halfway across the continent before her brothers came, beat him up, nearly killing him in the time before Madara arrived and chased them off, and dragged her back to some place called Whirlpool. The word Databeo ended up haunting their great-great-grandfather's nightmares until the day he died, all of 24 years old. He was damn glad Naruto wasn't a girl, considering what his great-great-grandmother was like, and considering how much Naruto had inherited from her. Having him as a fangirl probably would have killed him. When he showed Naruto the picture of cousin Obito, who bore something of a resemblance to the Uzumaki despite the fact that Obito had black hair and black eyes and Naruto was a blonde with blue eyes, he decided not to mention that he'd encountered Obito's name before in his father's older journals. Mentions of Obito had mainly been in conjunction with the words idiot and moron. After examining Obito's picture, Naruto asked a bunch of painful questions about their family that he hadn't really wanted to answer while they waited for their perpetually tardy sensei to arrive. Kakashi showed up with I was helping an old lady carry her groceries home. When he'd felt he'd kept his little team waiting long enough, Naruto turning out to have the Sharingan had solved a bit of a problem for him. When it came to the saying those who can't do teach, the converse was also true. Those who could do generally couldn't teach because you had to be able to think very carefully about how you did the things you just simply did and find a way of effectively conveying it all to others without resorting to "dunno, I just do it." He hadn't been allowed to reject this team, however, this team that had somehow actually managed to pass his test where all others failed, and he hadn't known what to do with them once he got them. With Sasuke, it had simply been a waiting game over the Sharingan. Once Sasuke had the Sharingan, it would have been easy. Just monkey see, monkey do, then done. Once he'd determined that Sasuke had copied enough and was actually fast enough to actually use what he'd copied without getting himself killed, he would put him up for promotion, and that would be that. Sakura didn't seem to care too much about her ninja career and seemed to see her position on the team as a means to becoming Mrs. Uchiha. With that in mind, he'd decided to set her to pretty much the standard academy forms until she decided to take things seriously. If she decided to take things seriously, he would have found a way to foist her off onto someone else. There were a sizable number of people who owed him favors, including Mato Guy who'd either whip her into shape real quick or kill her trying. With Naruto, however, he had the feeling that he should be teaching his sensei's son like he said he would while the child was still inside his mother. He just didn't know where or how to begin. The boy had been a total mess when the academy finally turned him loose on the world in that overbright jumpsuit, and still was. Now that Naruto had the Sharingan, he had an idea as to what to do. Naruto could play monkey see, monkey do with Sasuke, smiling at Naruto and Sakura's antics as they screamed about his being late despite the fact that he was always late. He chucked a scroll at Sakura and called the boys over. Sakura sighed. About the only time she saw her family these days was at dinner. She was up with the sun almost every morning and out the door before mother had breakfast finished despite the fact that she knew she could sit down long enough to devour a 7-course meal before Kakashi arrived. While Kakashi seemed to think the rules regarding punctuality didn't exist, she was determined to not fall into such bad habits. That, and arriving at the stated time allowed her to spend time with Sasuke and try to win him over. One of these days she'd get a date. So, how did your day go? Her mother asked when she came in the door. Pretty good actually. After training, we got a D-rank walking dogs. Naruto took the biggest dog and it dragged him straight into a trap field. Sasuke yelled at the dog's owner for like 10 minutes straight when the mission was over. She replied, remembering how the boy who didn't usually say more than 10 words a day had actually shown passion for something. Sure, that passion was a streak of overprotectiveness for Naruto, but if Sasuke was that protective over his third cousin, imagine how protective he'd be over his own children. Really? Her mother asked, cutting into her dreams of being married to a Sasuke who fiercely defended her and their children from any and all who tried to attack. By the way, Sasuke and Naruto figured out how they were related. Sakura said, back in the land of the living rather than Fantasyland. They're both great-great-grandsons of Uchiha Izuna. That name sounds familiar, her father said with a frown. Her father was a history buff and was practically obsessed with anything related to the founding of Konoha, so there was good odds that he'd recognize the name but couldn't quite place it. He was Uchiha Madara's younger brother, Sakura said. She knew this fact because she'd gotten a good look at the family tree that Sasuke had shown Naruto when Sasuke had asked her to guard it with her life while he and Naruto were sparring. Her mother choked on her food at this. What the hell was the yondaime thinking? I'd sooner trust a fox to guard a goddamn henhouse. Her father yelled. Darling, her mother said. Shut the hell up before. Sorry dear. Her father replied, looking cowed and slightly nervous, as if he feared that there were people listening at the windows. That night, Sakura went to bed once again wondering what it was that had to do with Naruto that her parents couldn't tell her, and what the yondaime had to do with it. When Naruto arrived for training the morning after he'd learned that he was Sasuke's third cousin, it was to find that Sasuke was there. But Sakura hadn't yet arrived despite the fact that Sakura lived closer to the training grounds than he and Sasuke did. The second he'd gotten within 10 feet of Sasuke, the other boy had thrown something at his head. He caught the bundle of cloth and discovered that it was a folded shirt which smelled like it had been freshly laundered. Naruto stared down at the shirt Sasuke had given him. It was nice of the jerk to give him a present, but the shirt was blue. It was blue, and it had that stupid-looking fan on the back of it. That stupid-looking fan that he'd used for target practice more times than he could count over the years that he'd been in the same class as Sasuke. That stupid-looking fan that had meant police. In his earlier memories from before the Uchiha massacre that he couldn't really believe he'd been stupid enough to forget about. Put it on, Sasuke said. Why? He asked. Clan law states that anyone who has the Sharingan is a Uchiha. Sasuke said. All Uchiha shinobi are to wear the symbol of our clan. But it's blue, he said. It wasn't that he wasn't appreciative of the gift, but orange was his color. It always had been since forever. Not only that, but it looked like it would actually fit, which was a bit of a problem. One of his tricks for escaping larger and stronger opponents was wriggling out of his clothes, leaving his would-be captor standing there holding said clothing. Doing so was much harder when the clothes he was wearing actually fit. Wear that for now. We'll get an orange one later if you insist, Sasuke said, making a face at the idea of an orange shirt for some reason. Sighing, he pulled off his jacket and pulled the blue shirt over his mesh top. The damn thing had that silly wide collar like the one on Sasuke's shirt which he'd used to amuse himself by throwing several items into over the years. The time he'd actually managed to get a frog in there had been utterly unforgettable and beyond hilarious. Come to think of it, that might not have been Sasuke. Too tall. Smelled like him though. Well, there was one plus about wearing the shirt that Sasuke had given him. Kakashi had done a slight double take when he saw what he was wearing when he finally deigned to show up. In anyone other than Kakashi, that would have been the equivalent of dropping one's jaw and bugging one's eyes out in shock. Sasuke brought Naruto to the Shinobi Outfitters where he usually purchased his clothing immediately after training and missions were over for the day. As he predicted, his cousin had grabbed something that was baggy and orange and had way too many pockets. He would have to have a very serious discussion with the boy later about proper attire. For now though, he would try to make sure that what the boy picked at least fit. It was true that clan law stated that all who had the Sharingan were Uchiha, but how the clan had usually interpreted that law ran counter to how he had chosen to interpret it in this case. Had he followed tradition, he would have rather swiftly become the last Uchiha in Konoha, and someone would have been stuck with the task of mopping up Naruto's blood and preparing him for burial. There were too few Uchiha left now to follow that bloody tradition though. That, and Naruto was family, his blood, his kin. Naruto would be helping him restore the clan when the time came. Because of that, Naruto was to be protected, especially if Itachi decided to come back and follow that tradition for his own personal amusement. When the two of them got to the counter after a great deal of bickering and an actual fight in the changing room, the old man who rang up their purchases went to the back room behind the counter and returned with a small box that he blew a great deal of dust off the top of. He then opened the box and pulled out several copies of the symbol of the minor, small, closer to family than clan, one that had few members in Konoha, one important, very important. Namikaze. That's not the right clan symbol, he said, wondering why the old man had brought out the symbol of the Namikaze, or what he was reasonably certain was the symbol of the small, now pretty much extinct, Namikaze clan. It's not, the cashier asked in surprise. I could have sworn it was. The cashier came back with another dust-covered box, a slightly larger one this time that had an odd design carved into the top and sides unlike the plain box that contained the symbol of the Namikaze clan. This one contained the symbol of the Senju clan. Now, he knew that the man was just messing with him. That's not right either, he said, barely resisting the urge to lean over the counter, grab the man by his neck, and slam the man's head into the counter repeatedly. Really? The cashier asked, acting like he hadn't deliberately brought out the wrong box. The cashier then went into the back for a third time, and came back with a much larger box, a cardboard one that didn't have a speck of dust on it this time. That contained the red spiral that was on the back of Naruto's jacket as well as on the backs of every Konoha uniform. Not that one either, he said, wondering what the cashier was playing at. The old man had tried to play this sort of game with him once before, but he'd only brought out the wrong box one time instead of three. Really? And, which one is the correct one then? The cashier asked, despite the fact that he didn't need to be told. The Uchiha, he replied coldly. His father was a Namikaze, and there's more Senju in him than Uchiha, and more Uzumaki than both. The cashier grumbled as he grabbed the box that contained the Uchiha fans, pulled out several, and started attaching them to the backs of Naruto's new shirts and coat in a manner that suggested that he would rather not. Nakahara Satoshi scowled as he watched the son of the bastard everyone knew but couldn't prove had summoned the Kyuubi lead the Kyuubi's jailer away. He'd seen the small thread of Uchiha when the Uzumaki boy's father had stood on the seal he'd kept to ensure that no one wore marks they weren't entitled to many years earlier. The thread was also present in the sun, twice as wide as it should be considering it should be half that of the father, but it was not wide enough for him to consider the boy Uchiha. The part of his job that he considered to be the most important was the guarding of the clan symbols that he stitched onto the clothing that he sold. A major part of guarding those clan sigils was ensuring that they went only to those of the proper heritage. As far as he was concerned, the boy who had just left with Uchiha Fugaku's offspring was Namikaze first, as that had been his father's clan, Senju second, as that had been in both parents' lines, Uzumaki third, as that was his mother's clan, and Uchiha last if at all, seeing as the boy was an eighth Uchiha at the most. Like his father, the arrogant little Uchiha bastard had stood there and coldly took almost all of the Uzumaki child's heritage away from him when he'd ordered the Uchiha to be placed on the Uzumaki child's clothing. He understood why the Hokage had chosen the Uzumaki name when he'd named the boy, considering the great things the Namikaze boy had grown up to do and the enemies he made while doing them. But this, more Senju than Uchiha. He grumbled as he put the boxes away for another day, knowing that 2 of them wouldn't be used in a good long time if ever again. Almost all of the small number of people who still bore the Senju name were civilians and didn't show any inclination to be otherwise. As for the Namikaze, the Uchiha boy had just ensured that their clan symbol would forever gather dust, like so many others that were stored in the back room. Sasuke frowned as he studied Naruto after they'd left the shop and started walking through the village. The more he looked at him, the more possible it seemed. Namikaze. Naruto was related to the Yondaime somehow, probably a nephew or a cousin. The Namikaze clan was small enough that he'd never encountered a Namikaze in his life, and had apparently virtually died out at some point. If the dust on the box that contained copies of their clan symbol for attachment to clothing purchases was anything to judge by, considering the war that had taken place shortly before he and Naruto were born and the Kyuubi attack, it was entirely possible that Naruto was the last of the Namikaze bloodline, if not one of the last. The fact that Naruto had Senju blood was far less of a surprise than that he was kin to the Namikaze. Every clan in Konoha had blood ties to the Senju, including a small portion of his own before the massacre. The relatives with Senju blood were often mocked within the privacy of the compound, and usually kept to the edges of it if they lived there at all. All of them came from minor families within the clan, and had no hope of marrying into the family of the clan head before they died. That Naruto was of the Uzumaki was no surprise at all, considering the boy's surname, which, if he had anything to say about it, would soon be changed. Naruto was a Uchiha. Whatever else he may have been alongside a Uchiha was irrelevant. What was that all about back at the shop, Dadabeo? Naruto asked as he pulled on his new coat, which wasn't nearly as eye-searing a shade of orange as his old clothes had been. Honestly, he preferred the short-sleeved hoodie that Naruto used to wear back when they were 9 to the mess that he'd started wearing sometime a year or 2 later. I really don't know, he said, keeping his wince at the memory of Naruto's old clothes under control. The old man once tried to give me the symbol of some obscure clan, something to do with my father that I really hadn't been paying attention to. He had been paying attention that day, but Naruto didn't need to know that. The only reason he'd returned to that shop after such an insult was that it was the best in Konoha when it came to shinobi clothing. He'd heard the rumors about his father and how the math hadn't added up regarding a mission his grandfather had taken prior to his father's birth before when he had been small and did as his parents suggested, which was to ignore them. It stung, however, every time he'd heard the covert whispers about how the son of an outsider was leading the clan. His father had proven he belonged in his position several times over despite who his father may or may not have been. The old man probably thinks that you're the Yondaime's cousin or something, he continued, pulling himself out of dark memories. You look like you could be the Yondaime's cousin. Really? Naruto asked, with little stars in his eyes. From the looks of things, Naruto was about a half-second away from going back to the shop and getting the Namikaze clan symbol put on all of his clothing. I wouldn't try wearing the Namikaze clan symbol if I were you, he said, deciding to cut Naruto off at the pass. It was swore revenge on the Yondaime's family and will kill any of his clan that they encounter. Besides, you're Uchiha. Based on the look on Naruto's face when he mentioned it was plans for revenge on the Yondaime's relatives, whether they were real or not, it seemed that Naruto wouldn't be wearing anything but the red and white Uchiha on his clothing anytime soon. What was that whole thing with the Senju? Naruto asked as they approached the boys' apartment building, apparently still pondering the old shopkeeper's antics. Just about everyone in Konoha has Senju blood in them. You've probably got a tiny bit more than most, he replied, keeping his annoyance at that as hidden as he could. You're still Uchiha. I'm also related to the Shodai, the Nidaime, and the Yondaime. There's no way in hell I won't become Hokage, Naruto yelled excitedly, apparently seeing his dream that much closer. He and Naruto watched in complete shock an instant later as a patrolling ANBU missed a jump, fell off the edge of the roof of Naruto's apartment building, and landed in a dumpster instead of on the roof of Naruto's apartment building as he'd intended. Naruto immediately raced over to the dumpster and peered inside. Hey ANBU-san, are you alright? Naruto asked, his voice echoing loudly in the alley. He received a groan in response. Sasuke and Naruto turned to look at each other as one. This was so far out of Sasuke's realm of experience it wasn't even funny. He came up with the only response he could think of at the time, which was the method he used for sorting out disputes with his cousins that weren't worth bothering his father over. Loser gets the medics, he said as he put out a fist. He threw scissors, Naruto threw rock. He was almost completely winded when he reached the hospital, having run faster than he ever had in his entire life. What seems to be the problem, Uchiha-san? The nurse in the front lobby of the hospital asked. ANBU... fell off roof, landed in dumpster. He managed to gasp out when he finally started to catch his breath. This I've got to see," one of the standby medics yelled as he grabbed a first aid kit and prepared to follow him out the door. He felt like he was going to die by the time they reached Naruto's apartment building. He'd never run that fast for that long in his entire life. The ANBU was still lying in the dumpster, and Naruto was talking at him, apparently trying to keep him company until the Urionin arrived. Every third word seemed to be ramen. "What seems to be the problem, ANBU-san?" the medic asked with a shit-eating grin that he didn't even bother trying to keep off his face. Two more medics appeared as the ANBU summarized the situation with a rather liberal use of swear words, some of which were new to Sasuke. And he'd thought he'd heard everything before after his father had had a particularly bad day at the office, which had ended with him coming home completely covered in orange glitter. One of the medics had a camera and was taking pictures for evidentiary purposes should the ANBU wish to press charges against Uzumaki Naruto. Sasuke had a sneaking suspicion that the pictures were going to be put to a different use, however, if the grin on the man's face was any indication. Eventually, after giving a statement to the medics and another ANBU that had shown up out of nowhere, Sasuke and Naruto made their way to Naruto's apartment with the packages that contained Naruto's new clothes. His first impression upon seeing the inside of Naruto's apartment was, Naruto would be better off living elsewhere. The apartment building wasn't the best, so he knew not to expect a penthouse suite, say. Like the building, the apartment wasn't the best, nor was it the absolute worst either. While not in the best shape, it was at least structurally sound, and didn't look to be infested with insects, arachnids, or rodents. The furniture looked to be older than Naruto by several years if not decades, and Naruto's housekeeping skills left a great deal to be desired. He would have to teach Naruto how to clean up after himself amongst other things. "Pack up," he said when Naruto had set his new clothes down on a table. "Why?" Naruto asked. "You're moving to the Uchiha district," he replied. "Why?" Naruto asked, looking shocked and confused. "You're Uchiha, and that's where you belong," he replied. It was as simple as that. The Uchiha district was home to the Uchiha, and Naruto was a Uchiha. Life in the Uchiha district had been lonely with only him to occupy it, only him and his memories. Now there was another to share the virtually empty district that was a daily reminder of his loss and reason for revenge with him. He was sure that life with the Dobe would be many things, but there was one thing it would not be, and that was boring. Naruto refused to pack. He'd let Sasuke boss him around so far since he was his cousin, and most of what he said and did seemed to make some sort of sense. He was Uchiha, so he wore the Uchiha fan, even if he thought it looked totally stupid. That he understood. Moving to the Uchiha district when he had a perfectly fine apartment that had been his home for years, however. He wouldn't move to the Uchiha district even if Sasuke offered him the biggest house in the place. Besides being fucking creepy and almost completely empty, someone had seriously been neglecting the upkeep there. He should know, since he'd wandered around the place a few times after dark. No matter what his jerk of a cousin said, he would be staying in his nice cozy rat-free apartment that was located somewhere where there were people and there was noise to distract him from the loneliness. Seriously, the rats in the Uchiha district could eat Kiba's dog. Heck, they could eat Kiba, and nobody would be there to hear them scream if they did. Sasuke ordered him to pack once again when he'd failed to get a move on the second Sasuke had said jump. He'd been quiet about Sasuke's demands because he was trying to be nice to the only family he had in the village, or at least the only family he had in the village that was willing to acknowledge him. He would be quiet no longer. Not doing it. I'm staying here where I know I won't get my face gnawed off in my sleep, Databao," he said. The Uchiha district's got rats the size of Akamaru. Sasuke looked stunned at this for some strange reason, or at least stunned in that oddly apathetic way Sasuke managed. He had vague memories of an older boy who did that, one of the ANBU if he remembered correctly. Some bastard had given the unfortunate sod monkey's shift on the day he'd finally gotten the prank for that jerk set up, and Ponytail Boy who, now that he thought about it, could have been an Uchiha ended up getting caught in it. The poor bastard had actually landed in the same dumpster that other ANBU guy landed in earlier. His landing was a bit softer though since it was full at the time though. "Rats?" Sasuke asked. "Yeah, big honkin' ones. They're effing everywhere, Databao," he replied, wondering why Sasuke didn't know this since he actually lived in the Uchiha district. "How could you have not seen them? Would you care to show me these rats?" Sasuke asked as if he didn't believe him. "Sure, meet me at the gate at, say 8 or so," he replied. "I'm usually in bed by 8, Sasuke said. "Why?" he asked, wondering why someone would go to bed that freaking early. "It's my bedtime," Sasuke replied. "TCH, whatever," he said. Kiba did a slight double take when he saw Naruto as he was heading home. The boy was wearing a new jacket. A jacket that didn't look like the one he'd worn for the last 2 years straight. There had been a time when he believed that Naruto had only one outfit since his clothes were always dirty, but Shikamaru had somehow figured out that Naruto had 3 identical copies of the same outfit like most of the rest of them. Sakura had 5 identical copies of that red dress of hers, and Sasuke had the most at 7 identical copies of that stupid shirt and 5 pair of those dumb shorts. "Hey Naruto, I see that you finally decided to change your clothes," Kiba said. Naruto usually changed the style of his attire at a rate of about once every 2 years or so as opposed to once a year like the rest of the class, which made today's change of attire a complete surprise, since it was way ahead of schedule. "Yeah, neat huh," Naruto said as he spun around so he could take in the entire outfit. One little detail stood out immediately, namely the big honkin' red and white Uchiha on the back of Naruto's new jacket. "Naruto, why the hell are you wearing the Uchiha clan symbol?" he asked, wondering why Sasuke hadn't pummeled him for it already, considering the news of what Naruto was wearing had to have gone around town at like the speed of light. "Because I'm a Uchiha," Naruto replied, as if the answer were patently obvious. "No you're not," he said, wondering why the hell Naruto was pretending to be a Uchiha. Naruto was always chasing around after Sasuke, trying to be as good as him, but to go this far. "Yes I am," Naruto yelled back. Naruto's eyes turned red with black dots in them. Sharingan. He really wanted to know how the hell the other boy managed to do that, since Naruto sucked royally at Genjutsu. It was at that point that one of the Hyuga that had been wandering around the marketplace that he'd been cutting through when he'd encountered Naruto took one look at Naruto and yelled, "Holy shit." Several people turned to see the source of the outburst, and upon noticing the Hyuga's active Byakugan, a mob of rather pissed-off women chased him out of the marketplace. After the Hyuga pervert was duly chased off, several people turned to look at Naruto. Oddly enough, many of them didn't look surprised to see that Naruto seemed to have the Sharingan. His sensitive ears picked up several hissed whispers of Madara's eyes as Naruto walked off to some appointment he had after excusing himself. Just what the hell was going on? Naruto met Sasuke at the gate of the Uchiha district at the appointed time. From the looks of things, Sasuke had been training practically since the moment he'd left his apartment until it was time for the two of them to meet. "So, let's go and see these alleged rats," Sasuke said, still not looking like he believed a word Naruto had said about the monstrous creatures that he was convinced had to be mutants or something. "Okay," Naruto replied. It was just dark enough for the creatures to be out and about, so Sasuke would have to see he was telling the truth. As they wandered through the silent and dark district, Naruto asked about the buildings he and his cousin passed, trying to overcome his nervousness. One thing he was afraid of besides the ginormous rats were ghosts. He didn't know why people didn't believe him when he said he saw one. He saw the ghost back when he was 8. He'd woken up one night to find a dark-haired man in a strange mask with only one eye hole sitting there staring at him. When he threw the kunai he kept under his pillow just in case one of the villagers who gave him those hateful looks all the time got any big ideas at the man, it had gone straight through him and into the wall behind him. Somehow, he could tell that the man, or ghost rather, was exceedingly pissed at him for throwing the kunai at him as he vanished an instant later. "What's that building over there?" he asked as he pointed to a rather nondescript building near the middle of the district. "That's the clan library," Sasuke replied. "I'll bet it has a ton of awesome jutsu inside. I can't wait to learn them all," Naruto exclaimed as he imagined himself learning some sort of super secret Uchiha technique that had previously been lost to the mists of time. Sasuke sighed deeply at this for some reason. Why does everyone assume that the Uchiha clan library is chock full of jutsu scrolls? Sasuke practically moaned. "You mean it isn't?" Naruto asked. "If you could remember practically every jutsu you ever saw for the rest of your life, would you really write the information down and leave it where some outsider could sneak in and steal it?" Sasuke asked. "When you put it that way," Naruto muttered, feeling embarrassed for yet again speaking without stopping to think. While he still wanted his name on the Kia Memorial so he could be remembered as one of the village's greatest heroes, he didn't want that happening until he was old and gray like the old man and had several decades as Hokage under his belt. That way, the entry on the memorial stone would have the title Hokage next to it, just like the ones for the Shodai, Nidaime, and Yondaime. Uzumaki, or Uchiha Naruto Godaime Hokage, had a nice ring to it. "So what is in the library?" he asked, honestly curious to learn what his and Sasuke's clan had considered worth keeping in their library. "Clan records, genealogy charts, some of our ancestors' journals, books on just about everything under the sun," Sasuke replied. It was at that point that the scurrying that Naruto had been both anticipating and dreading finally started. A rat that would give one of the larger Inuzuka nin dogs a run for their money popped out of a hole near the foundation of one of the houses. All over the district, the rats went on the move, prowling their territory for the night, hissing, fighting, mating, and gnawing on just about anything and everything. How could Sasuke have not known about this? Hyuga Hayashi sat impassively listening to the report one of the branch members was giving him. He'd heard the rumors that had been flying through the civilian population. If certain civilians were to be believed, the Kyuubi's Jinchuriki was a descendant of none other than Uchiha Madara himself. He'd learned to take such rumors with a grain of salt long ago, however, and had been waiting on more concrete evidence before he would believe something so unbelievable. "How were you able to discern this?" he asked. According to the branch member, he'd only gotten a glimpse of the Sharingan, and that left the question of why he'd had his Byakugan active at the time. "I was the branch member said, sounding slightly embarrassed. "You were looking through people's clothes again, weren't you?" he said, doing his best not to sigh and break his act of intimidating impassivity. The red flush and squeak that was oddly reminiscent of his elder daughter was all the answer he needed. Most Hyuga seemed to go through this phase during their teens. It usually passed by the time one reached their mid-20s and their hormones began to settle. Most Hyuga were discreet about this and didn't get themselves caught. The particular branch member in front of him, however, was usually caught at least once a week. He would have to deal with that later. For now, however, he had to ponder the latest revelations about Uzumaki Kushina's son. That woman had packed quite a punch when they were children, and he'd rather quickly learn that it was best to not get caught looking through her clothes a second time. Behind the counter of his family's shop, business office, Senju Aramaki sighed as he flipped through his magazine. It had been a rather slow week. Come to think of it, it had been a rather slow month and a rather uneventful year. As he was reading an article on baking tips for housewives, the bell above the door tinkled. He turned around to find Uchiha Sasuke walking in. Uchiha Sasuke, who was as arrogant as and had a worse attitude than most of his late and mostly unlamented clan combined. There had been a time when he'd pitied the child, but, Uchiha-sama, he said in his trying to be nice to customers he'd rather have dropped dead tone of voice. What can I do for you this afternoon? I came to talk to you about a set of pest control seals that were supposed to be good for a decade. The Uchiha boy said, sounding as if he were barely restraining a great deal of anger. What about them? He asked. Whatever it was, it sounded more like a complaint rather than a request to have them put on that ghost town the boy called home. The Uchiha boy slammed a rather sizable dead rat down on the counter. Can you explain why there are thousands of these running around the district when father had those seals put in only 8 years ago? The Uchiha boy asked. Thousands? He squeaked in a totally manly manner as he looked down at the massive rat that had been slammed down on the shop counter where he usually ate his lunch. Great, just fucking great. Kanda had cut corners again and he was going to have to pay for it. His family had been exterminators for 3 generations and were the best in Konoha. So good that the Uchiha had chosen to ignore the fact that they were Senju in both blood and name when they had contracted them for their services despite the simmering animosity between both clans that the founding hadn't eradicated. Thanks to Kanda's lazy ways, however, their reputation was seriously slipping. The last thing they needed was a scandal the likes of this one seemed to be shaping up to be. The extermination service will be free, as will the replacement seals, which I will see to personally. He ground out. The next time he saw Kanda, he was a dead man. Brother or no, there were some things you just didn't let slide. Naruto yawned as he answered the door. His team had a day off, and he had been catching up on sleep. He probably should have gotten up earlier, considering the fact that it was mid-afternoon, but he felt that he deserved a lazy day in bed after all the shit he'd gone through recently. He hadn't had a lazy day like the one he was having and thoroughly enjoying until someone had come pounding on his door in a good long time. When he opened the door, it had been to find his cousin on his doorstep with a couple bags at his feet. Can I stay with you? Sasuke asked. Something about the boy's tone indicated it wasn't a request. Why? He asked, though he had a sneaking suspicion as to what the answer might be, considering what he and Sasuke had been doing the night before, namely running from the biggest and meanest rats to ever grace Fire Country with their presence. The exterminators are going to be spraying the entire district with rat poison, and it won't be livable for the next week or so. Sasuke grumbled, apparently still sore over the fact that he hadn't been lying about the rats. Yeah, sure, whatever. I hope you brought your futon since all I've got is the bed, and I'm not sharing it with you. Naruto replied as he moved aside to let his cousin in. Aramaki sighed in relief as he went from house to house. Everything had been properly sealed away and stored somewhere before he arrived. He couldn't count the number of times he'd been forced to sit there waiting for a homeowner to finish putting their crap away before he could get his job done. And almost all of those homeowners had been rude as hell and had left him sitting on the porch until they finished. Sure, he billed them for the wasted time, but still. The clan head's residence, which looked to be the only lived-in house, was properly emptied as well, which meant that he could get to work right away rather than sitting around getting sunstroke while he jealously watched through the window as the people who should have been finished packing stuff away drank something cold while they worked, freezing to death while the jerks inside sipped hot tea. He carefully skirted a suspicious-looking stain on the floor in one of the rooms as Kanda arrived in the middle of his inspection of the head's residence. Seriously, what sort of messed-up kid willingly lived in the same place in which his parents had been slaughtered? Yes, who gets to clean up all the bodies this time? He chirped mock cheerfully as Kanda picked up an envelope which had been addressed to him that had been left on the kitchen counter. Not funny, man. Being here is bad enough as it is, his brother said with a shudder as he opened the note that had been left for them. What the hell? Kanda said as he read the note. What's it say? Aramaki asked. Don't forget to get under the 7th tatami mat from the far right in the Naka shrine. Kanda replied, looking confused. Whoever wrote this wasn't Sasuke. Whatever, Aramaki said. Some people had the strangest places for hiding crap they thought was valuable. So, what do you think this is? Kanda asked as he inspected the strange stone slab in the room beneath the Naka shrine that they had decided to take on first a half hour later. Don't know, don't care. His brother Aramaki replied as he sprayed poison and laid down several traps. The rats in the Uchiha district were exceedingly vicious, much like the Uchiha themselves had been. He discovered that when he'd accidentally knocked over a rusted trash can in an alley, sending several of the damn things attacking rather than fleeing like normal rats. As they say, you are what you eat, and those rats had been eating Uchiha homes for years. Something had to have rubbed off on them because of it. He really shouldn't have cut corners on those effing seals in places he didn't think anyone would notice. Even if the 10-year seals were a bitch to make. If he knew that anything that lived here would mutate like that back then, he'd have gone through all that trouble and then some. Probably would have found a way to invent a pest-repellent seal that lasted 10,000 years so neither he nor any of his descendants would ever have to come back. He could see beady red eyes peering out at him from a hole in the corner of the massive room that looked large enough to hold almost the entire Uchiha clan, and he was almost willing to swear that there were Tamo in them. "Let's hurry up and get out of here. This place is giving me the creeps, Nai-chan," he said, shuddering. Aramaki stopped and stared at him. He knew why. He hadn't called Aramaki Nai-chan in a good long time. Not since they were small children. The ANBU, commonly known as Monkey, scowled as he peered into the Uzumaki boy's window to make sure the brat was okay and not plotting Konoha's imminent destruction, as that was part of his patrol on this route. He had been put on the route that he'd avoided like the plague for years after Rat had broken his leg in the middle of his patrol. He hated this route with a passion, and for good reason. He and the Uzumaki hadn't hit it off on the few times they'd encountered each other face to face, and it didn't have anything to do with the Uzumaki's unwelcome tenant. To say that the Uzumaki disliked him was an understatement, and frankly the feeling was mutual. After the little misfire that had landed Uchiha Itachi in a dumpster while he'd been in the hospital recovering from a mission gone wrong, the Uzumaki had come after him with a vengeance. Nothing less could be expected of the offspring of the red-hot-blooded habanero. He still had nightmares in which that boy's mother came back from the dead to beat the shit out of him for calling her tomato to her face. Calling her tomato years after they'd graduated the academy and she'd picked up a more suitable nickname in battle had probably been one of the dumbest mistakes in his entire life. While the woman had been an utter failure at the academy, like her son, she had not been anything approaching one outside of it. Tonight, Uchiha Boy was over, and he was scowling at the dinner the Uzumaki prepared. Apparently instant ramen wasn't good enough for the prima donna that, according to rumor, was related to the Uzumaki. Considering the fact that the Uzumaki was now wearing the red and white Uchiha, he supposed that rumor was fact. It figured, no one could hold a grudge like a Uchiha. A major part of the reason behind their downfall had been that grudge holding. They had been holding grudges from centuries before the founding. Sparrowhawk sighed as she did her patrol of the Uchiha district. The place was empty and dead. Nothing ever happened here these days. Patrols were much more fun a few years back when she and the others could take bets on who was cheating on who and the like. There was none of that now. There was just emptiness. Emptiness and desolation. Emptiness and desolation. And the Senju exterminators running screaming from a house as an army of rats pursued them. Wait, what? It had only been 2 days since Sasuke had moved in, and Naruto was already ready to tear his hair out. Sasuke had nitpicked everything and wouldn't stop complaining. Naruto, do this. Naruto, do that. Naruto, clean that up. Naruto, we're not having cup ramen for every meal, even if it's cheap and you're a bottomless pit. He mocked under his breath as Sasuke launched into another lecture on how a proper Uchiha was supposed to act. He was beginning to see why his cousin Itachi had murdered the clan. He was about ready to strangle Sasuke after living with him for only 2 days. If the rest of their relatives had been like this, well, quite frankly, the Uchiha were lucky they had survived as long as they did. The Uchiha had to be good, otherwise all their neighbors would have ganged up on them and done the job for Itachi ages ago. Grumbling, Naruto picked his dirty clothes up off the floor and dropped them into the laundry hamper that Sasuke had brought with him. Seriously, who brings a laundry hamper with them when they're staying over at someone's place? After a morning of arguing with Naruto as he tried to educate the boy in basic manners, Sasuke had to go out for training rather than doing what he'd wanted to do, which was to go back to bed, curl up under his blanket and pretend the day had never started. The second he reached the training field with Naruto trailing behind, Sakura started in on him, suggesting things like walks, or a date, or dinner with her family so he could meet her parents. He'd mostly tuned her out until she'd mentioned the dinner with her family, at which point his stomach had driven him to accept. He ignored the stunned look on Sakura's face when he'd accepted her dinner invitation. The look that seemed to say that now that she'd gotten him, she honestly didn't know what the heck to do with him. He normally wouldn't have done such a thing as accept something so intimate as dinner, considering the potential consequences. But after 2 days of nothing but ramen and no hope of anything else for the rest of the week, he was ready to jump at the chance of a nice home-cooked meal. He would have done the cooking at Naruto's place himself, if all of the food in the fridge and cupboards that wasn't instant ramen wasn't spoiled, and the people who usually delivered his food didn't refuse to deliver to Naruto's place because something that had to do with a prank the boy had pulled years before. While he was dumb enough and hungry enough to accept the dinner date, he wasn't stupid enough to go alone. After training was over for the day, he, Naruto, and Kakashi would be heading over to the Haruno residence, as he'd made the invitation of the rest of the team a condition of his acceptance. Training for that day went the way it always went with Kakashi. Activate Sharingan, watch, copy, and ignore Sakura's squealing over how awesome he was. Haruno Mebuki did her best to smile graciously as Sakura's teammates entered her home. It was hard as hell. First of all, there was the demon who had taken her older sister. Then there was the Uchiha that her daughter was so foolishly infatuated with. Then there was the messed up former ANBU sensei of theirs who had a reputation for being a pervert amongst the civilians since he frequently read erotic literature in public as a means of pushing everyone away and avoiding social contact with anyone who wasn't Mato guy who couldn't take a hint. If that wasn't bad enough, she vaguely recalled there being some sort of scandal involving the Hadake's father back when she was a teenager. While she pitied the Uchiha boy for being left all alone in the world, she really didn't lament the loss of the Uchiha clan all that much. Arrogant and likely traitorous pricks, the lot of them. Let it not be said that she spoke ill of the dead aloud, but she was one of the ones who was sure that the boy's father had been the one to unleash the Kyuubi on Kano. After the Uchiha died, their sins may as well have been wiped clean in the minds of some. In her mind, however, the Uchiha deserved what they got. She would not hold things against the survivor who was both innocent and ignorant of the crimes of his parents, however. At least not until she got a more accurate measure of the boy who had spent years rejecting the attentions of her daughter. As Mabuki, her husband, her daughter, and her daughter's team sat at the dinner table, she struggled to find a topic of conversation. "That is a very interesting outfit, Naruto-kun," she finally said after a while of searching about for something to say. The boy was wearing an orange and black coat that seemed vaguely familiar for some strange reason and black pants. "Yeah, I got it at the place where Sasuke buys his clothes." The old man behind the counter was weird. First he tried to give me the Namikaze clan symbol, then he tried to give me the Senju clan symbol, then he tried to give me the Uzumaki clan symbol before he gave up and gave me the Uchiha clan symbol like Sasuke told him to. The demon replied, sounding very much like a 12-year-old child. Haddock Kakashi, who had yet to remove his face mask in her line of sight, but who had somehow managed to finish his meal during the brief distraction that had been caused by a nearby explosion which had turned out to be one of Sakura's tags going off, randomly reacted strangely to the demon's statement. "Sasuke thinks that the old man thinks that I'm the Yondame's cousin or something," the demon continued. This caused another unusual reaction in Sakura's rather stoic-looking sensei. "But," Sakura started, looking confused for some odd reason, "the whole Senju thing is because I got Senju ancestors like everyone else in Konoha. My mother was an Uzumaki, so that one's what Sasuke calls self-explanatory." The demon continued as if Sakura hadn't interrupted. "Oh," she said, suddenly finding herself curious. "Who is your mother then, Naruto-kun?" "Dunno, other than the fact that her name was Uzumaki and that her great-grandma couldn't marry her great-grandpa because she had to go back to some place called Whirlpool." The demon replied. "Monkey Anbu-sen called me Habanero's brat a few times though." Her husband made a rather strange choking noise at this that sounded suspiciously like tomato. She would have to ask later. Based on the appraising looks her husband was giving the demon, it was possible that he knew who the demon was talking about. All too soon, the meal was over and she was almost gladly ushering Sakura's teammates out of the house. The demon had atrocious manners, and the Uchiha boy was rapidly losing any and all of her remaining pity for him. He was just as stuck-up and arrogant as the rest of his clan. Why they put him within a mile of the demon she didn't know, considering the possibility that his father or his mother who had also been missing that day could have passed down the secret for controlling the Kyuubi. The sensei was the last to leave. When he did, he turned to them with a cold look in his eye and said, "Say anything about what you heard this evening, and I will kill you myself." She turned to her husband and child in confusion only to see a dawning look of realization come across her daughter's face, which was soon replaced by an expression of total shock, then denial. "What is it, sweetie?" she asked as soon as the door was closed. "It can't be. It can't be," Sakura said, sounding as if there was something major that he didn't want to believe. "What is it?" she asked again. The Namikaze were a minor clan that originated near what is present-day Kirigakure. At the time of Konoha's founding, there were only 2 surviving members, a mother and a son. "But," Sakura said. "But what, sweetheart?" she asked, worried about her daughter's distressed expression, especially in light of her sensei's threat. "All of the Yondame's other relatives died long before a child Naruto's age could be conceived," Sakura exclaimed, unaware that she'd just spit out a major S-rank secret that Mabuki hadn't known about until her daughter had said it and the pieces had slotted together. Her husband looked shocked, then thoughtful before muttering, "This is so far above my old pay grade it isn't funny." Her husband didn't look like he would sleep anytime soon when they crawled into bed that night. "What is it, dear?" she asked her husband, who looked extremely disturbed after the sleepless silence had started getting to her. He knew that something like that was going to happen, and he planned for it. Tazashi said. "What do you mean, dear?" Mabuki asked. "Don't you think it's rather odd that the Kyuubi wasn't seen at any time between the Valley of the End and that day 12 years ago?" her husband asked. "Well, now that you mention it, yes, it could be considered odd," she replied, realization starting to dawn despite the fact that she'd learned when she was young that of the 9 Biju, only the Kyuubi had been unsealable. If that thing could be sealed in the Uzumaki boy, it could have been sealed in someone else, her husband said. Someone who was growing old, someone whose seal was weakening, someone that the Uchiha could have discovered and made a play for. "Oh God," she said, seeing where her husband was going with this. "Senju and Uchiha for control, Uzumaki for longevity." That Uzumaki boy's birth was no coincidence. The Yondaime personally made sure that there was another host waiting in the wings in case of something like what happened that day. The only problem was that it wasn't born in time to prevent most of the destruction. The instructors back at the academy all said that Uzumaki Kushina was special when I asked why they kept her around. All I saw back then was a massively incompetent foreign loser with a loud mouth and a penchant for pranks. Kazashi said. "You mean, the Yondaime never asked anyone to do what he wasn't willing to do himself," her husband said. "The wily bastard sacrificed his own son long before it was even conceived." Sakura silently slunk away from her parents' bedroom door, almost too shocked to process what she'd heard. The yondaime hadn't killed the Kyuubi, he'd sealed the monster into a child he'd intended to throw away from the start. A child that practically the entire village hated for a reason they wouldn't name. Which, now that she thought of it, was too extreme a reaction for all of the pranks Naruto pulled. Kakashi-sensei knew. He had to have known considering the threat he'd made. Who else knew? Everyone in the village. Everyone except us children. That's who. That had to be the reason they hated Naruto, the reason why they had told them to stay away from him, the reason they blamed Naruto for something she couldn't quite catch when she listened to the odd whispers that surrounded the whisker-cheeked boy. Naruto had been born a minute, an hour, or a day too late to foil the Uchiha's plans, whatever they had been. Because of that, everyone blamed him for what happened. Blamed him for everyone who died. That was so unfair. And, like her father and Kakashi-sensei said, she couldn't tell anybody. Senju Aramaki sat on the porch of one of the Uchiha homes next to his brother Kanda and sighed. The job was finally finished. Done. The last of the rat carcasses had been hauled away, and the final seal had been laid. He had been tempted to burn the Uchiha district to the ground and call it a day many times over the course of the week, but had refrained from doing so. Barely. Being rescued by one of the ANBU that first night had been particularly embarrassing. I'll never cut corners on a job again, I swear, Kanda said. That had to have been the most difficult and frightening experience of my entire life. See that you don't, Aramaki said. This had been probably the most difficult experience of his entire career as well. The Uchiha district was completely rat-free, and they couldn't collect the sort of pay that would usually come with a job this size since the Uchiha had had a 10-year warranty on the job they did 8 years ago, and they were fixing Kanda's little screw-up. Let's go tell our customer that it's safe to move back in and go home, Aramaki said as he got up, dusted himself off, and tiredly trudged out of the Uchiha district. After walking for what seemed like forever, he and his brother reached the contact address the Uchiha had left. He raised his hand to knock on the door, and was stopped by a loud yell coming from inside. For the last time, bastard, I'm not illiterate. A voice that he found oddly familiar yelled. You sure could have fooled me, Yuzure Tonkachi. How the fuck did you learn the cage bunchin' out of a scroll anyway, dope? The voice of his greatly hated Uchiha customer yelled back. Convinced they were done screaming at each other for the moment, Aramaki tentatively knocked on the door, hoping that the two inside the apartment wouldn't be too upset at the interruption. The door was answered by a very familiar-looking blonde. A familiar-looking blonde who was said to be descended from Uchiha Madara himself. Frankly, he didn't see it. What do you want? The blonde said, sounding grumpy and mumbling under his breath. I wanted to inform Uchiha-sama that the job is finished, and that he can return to the Uchiha district anytime he chooses. He replied. Finally, the Uzumaki snapped. Okay, maybe there was something in the boy's expression that could be construed as Madara-ish. Pack your shit, Sasuke, you're leaving. The blonde Jinchuriki called over his shoulder. And that was that. The job was done, and all that was left was to go to the bar. The bar where there were whispers that the Senju and Uchiha lines had been deliberately crossed to create a perfect host for the Kyuubi. Naruto grumbled as Kakashi called him aside during training. The last time the man had done that had been to tell him to never ever mention his blood link to the yondaime again. It turned out that there really had been death threats from Mu, and that he was damned lucky that the information about his most famous relative hadn't gotten out when he'd yelled it for the whole world to hear the day the ANBU landed in the dumpster. Oddly enough, Kakashi hadn't called him over to tell him to hide more of his ancestry or something. Instead, the man had wanted to ask how he'd been holding up because of the week with Sasuke. He honestly didn't think that he could spend that much time in close quarters with the other boy again without strangling him. If he ever heard another lecture on how a proper Uchiha was supposed to act again, it would be too soon. After asking how he'd been holding up, Kakashi made a request that had made him sit there and laugh in the man's face. The man who knew how well he got on with Sasuke even after the revelation that they were family and that they mixed like oil and water wanted him to move into the Uchiha district with the other boy since he didn't think Sasuke should be alone any longer. Apparently, he seemed to think the fact that the rats had been removed would have removed the rest of his reservations about that place as well. He wouldn't move into the Uchiha district even if Sasuke offered him his own house free and clear. His apartment was his home, and it had been his home since he was 6, and nothing would make him give it up. Training had gone the way it had usually had, dinner had been at Ikaraku Ramen, and the evening routine after he'd gotten home had been utterly normal without anything out of the ordinary happening before Naruto went to bed. He didn't know what had woke him up that night. When he did snap awake, it was to find a man in a weird orange mask with only one eye hole staring at him. "What the fuck are you doing in my apartment, asshole?" He yelled at the stranger who was sitting there like he owned the place. The strange man, who reminded him of the ghost he'd seen when he was 8 despite the fact that this man's mask was orange and his hair was short, didn't move. Not even when he grabbed a kunai and chucked it at him. The kunai went through the man and embedded itself in the wall behind him. The masked ghost who, now that he thought about it, was more than likely a genjutsu cast by some creepy pervert didn't move. Fine, Naruto yelled. Whether at the man or at the world at large, he didn't know. That's it. I'm moving to the Uchiha district. At least everyone will be too creeped out by that place to sneak in the middle of the night and bother me there. Skirting around the genjutsu. Intruder. Naruto then grabbed one of the boxes Kakashi had rather pointedly given him earlier that day before dismissing him and started chucking clothes into it. Tobai silently watched as the Jinchuriki stormed about the apartment throwing random items into boxes. He knew about his promise to Itachi, the eldest of the two surviving descendants of Izuna's line, which he couldn't kill off entirely, or Madara would slaughter him when he returned, but he had to come and see for himself in regards to certain rumors. As long as he didn't maim or kill anyone, make any threatening gestures, or act out on said gestures, everything would be fine, and nobody would need to know he'd been here. Nobody except for the Jinchuriki who had woken up while he'd been carefully scrutinizing his features, looking for any trace of Madara. Frankly, he couldn't see it. The blonde spawn of that bastard who taught him and not been there when Rin had needed him the most looked over from where he'd been checking random ninja equipment into a cardboard box. "What the fuck are you still doing here, Databao?" the blonde yelled. "Get fucking lost before I hurt you." The boy decided to back up his threat by activating his Sharingan. Okay, now he saw it. If that Databao was anything to judge by, he was one of Izuna's descendants, which he would not be mentioning to Madara when the man came back, considering. Well, the boy was one of Izuna's descendants if that interesting story Madara hadn't thought he'd overheard when that man had been grumbling about his lifetime of grievances, which had included being forced to dodge a pregnant Uzumaki that his brother had knocked up, had been true. That was. Holy shit, you're real, the blonde Jinchuriki yelled, looking completely stunned by this revelation. "Yes I am," he said, "and you better have better manners the next time I see you." "What makes you think I want to see you again?" yelled the blonde who had proven to be a near-carbon copy of his mother, but with his father's coloring and his Sharingan. "Whether or not you want to is irrelevant. You will be seeing me again," he replied. "The answer to the question of whether or not I will choose to allow you to die in agony or not depends entirely on you. You can blame your father for interfering with my plans when the time comes, as I wouldn't be killing you otherwise. Whatever, creepy pervert dude," the boy said as he moved into a more threatening stance. "Don't try my patience, boy," he said, showing the child his Mangekyo Sharingan, which totally beat the boy's piddling one-tamo Sharingan hands down before departing via his Kamui. After meeting the child in person when he was more than a tiny bundle of easily portable hostage, part of him was glad that Madara had scooped him up and recruited him before the Uzumaki was born. Knowing Minato-sensei, the man would have wanted him to be the boy's teacher. He wouldn't have lasted a week before strangling the child. Sasuke groaned as he opened the door to find his teammate, cousin, on his doorstep at stupid o'clock in the morning. Naruto had come pounding on his door at an insanely late, or rather early hour, waking him from what had previously been a sound sleep. When he opened his door to stop the frantic knocking, it had been to see the blonde on his doorstep with a couple of boxes at his feet. "Okay," Naruto yelled way too loudly. "Where do you want me to put my stuff? What made you change your mind?" he asked, honestly surprised that the blonde would do so quickly, if at all, considering how adamant he'd been about keeping his crappy little apartment. "Some creepy pervert with weird eyes snuck into my apartment and said he was gonna kill me," Naruto replied. Sasuke hastily ushered Naruto inside and checked for signs that the other boy had been followed. Much to his relief, he couldn't see anyone, even with the Sharingan active. He quickly got Naruto temporarily set up in his old room and went back to bed, only to discover that he couldn't fall asleep out of fear that Naruto's visitor would come calling here, where he and the Uzumaki were completely alone, vulnerable, and pretty much cut off from the village. If he ever found that pervert who had threatened his cousin, he swore he was going to kill him. Naruto yawned and stretched, and the instant he realized what day it was, he leapt out of bed. Today he would be participating in the Chunin exams. Kakashi-sensei had given his team the permission forms the day before with the choice of whether to turn them in or not, and there was no way he was going to chicken out now. He was most definitely ready, no matter what Sasuke thought. After racing through his morning shower, swiftly dressing, packing any supplies he thought he might need for the exams and then some, he headed downstairs to make breakfast. Breakfast this morning was a simple affair of an egg, a slice of slightly blackened toast, and a glass of milk. Once breakfast was over, he swiftly cleaned his dishes, raced out the door and down the street, and then turned and raced back to lock the door of the small house that was the furthest from the clan head's residence in the Uchiha district. Sasuke was fine in small doses. A few hours here and a few hours there were okay, but actually living with him, that was a different kettle of fish entirely. He'd lasted 3 days with Sasuke before he'd stormed out and found a different house. Sasuke had wanted him to stay as a matter of security. He refused. Security be damned. Sasuke's constant lectures on what a proper Uchiha was and wasn't had driven him up the wall, across the ceiling, and back down the opposite wall the way they had back when Sasuke had been staying with him, so the exterminators who'd cleared the rats out of the compound could do their work. The final argument over the fact that he hadn't yet filled out the paperwork to legally change his name had been the last straw. In the beginning, he'd been excited about the fact that Sasuke was family, and that he was a Uchiha, and he'd been willing to go along with the plan to change his name to reflect this. As time passed, however, he became reluctant to change his family name. It had been his mother's name, and it was all he had that had been hers. If he changed his name, he'd lose that. Sasuke didn't understand. As far as he was concerned, anyone who was a Uchiha should be named Uchiha, no ifs, ands, or buts about it. Today was not a day to be thinking about such things though, and he put it out of his mind as he made his way through the compound on his way to meet his cousin. Eventually, after he'd raced back once more to grab an item he'd forgotten in his haste to leave, he reached the main gate to the Uchiha district where Sasuke was already waiting, apparently just as anxious for the Chunin exams to start as he was. They set out to the academy where they would be meeting Sakura together in somewhat companionable silence, one of the numerous grades of silence he'd been forced to get used to over recent weeks and had begun to correctly interpret. As they walked to the academy, every Hyuga they passed glared at Sasuke. The morning after, or technically the morning he'd arrived at Sasuke's home with the intention of moving in, Sasuke had leveled some serious accusations at the Hyuga clan before he'd managed to inform his cousin that the creepy pervert with the weird eyes that had invaded his apartment had eyes that looked like the Sharingan, but not. Sasuke had panicked then, believing that Itachi had been in his apartment. He wasn't so sure though, the creepy pervert in the mask seemed older somehow. The damage to the relations between Sasuke and the Hyuga clan had already been done however, and the fact that Sasuke had refused to apologize because he had been in the wrong meant that that particular bridge was yet to be rebuilt. When they reached the academy grounds, Sakura was already there waiting for them to arrive. She gave Sasuke that strange greeting that she'd been giving him lately, and gave him that odd sad smile she'd taken to giving him around the same time she'd started acting strange around Sasuke and quit asking him out. He didn't know what that was all about, and she wouldn't tell him when he asked. Kakashi smiled when he saw that his entire genin team had been there to meet him, prepared to enter the exams. He had been half worried that he would have had to severely disappoint two of his students by turning them away. He hadn't been sure whether or not he should have entered his team in the first place, as the dynamics of the team were shifting and were somewhat unstable at the moment. But the damage was done and the only thing he could do now was congratulate his students and hope that the worst didn't happen. He knew and understood how and why the changes in interaction between Naruto and Sasuke had come about. Sasuke had been alone and without family for more than 4 years, and Naruto had been alone since the beginning because everyone who knew of Naruto's heritage had to hang back in the shadows in case they accidentally gave something away in regards to the boy's paternity that could get him killed. Discovering that they were family, even though they were rather distantly related, had caused the both of them to latch onto each other. They had personalities that mixed like oil and water, however, which created conflict, especially after Sasuke had decided to take on the role of parent, rather than elder sibling for some strange reason, which was something Naruto had gone without for his entire life and didn't know how to deal with. There were strong bonds between the boys, as well as some affection to counterbalance the conflict though. Sasuke's overprotectiveness that bordered on possessiveness was somewhat worrisome however. The change that had come about with Sakura in regards to Sasuke and Naruto was concerning, as he didn't know the source of it. Sakura's affection towards Sasuke had cooled a great deal all of a sudden, and he didn't know why. Instead of hanging off of him demanding his attention, she had a more watchful attitude around him, as if she thought he might somehow be a threat. It was her behavior towards Naruto that was most puzzling however. Rather than being her usual aggressive self around him and violently fending off his advances, she seemed to be verging on the border of tears every time she saw him. He knew why Sakura was afraid of him though. He'd nearly killed her and her family over something they hadn't done. They had taken his threat seriously and kept quiet about the revelations that had been made over the dinner at the Haruno residence. The rumors that Naruto had been deliberately bred to be a Jinchuriki had come from a different quarter that had fortunately left Naruto's father's name out of it, and he'd only learned of this after he'd captured Sakura and her retired ex-Chunin parents and had started thoroughly interrogating them in regards to their allegiances, considering nobody loyal to Konoha would have started spreading those rumors. Apparently, the now ex-Anbu who had fell into the dumpster after Naruto had started yelling about being related to 3 of the 4 Hokages had started to wonder exactly why the Kyubai's vessel was related to both the Senju and the Uchiha, and remembered the story of the Valley of the End where Uchiha Madara had controlled the Kyubai, and Senju Hashirama had taken it from him. Upon hitting the erroneous conclusion that Naruto had been deliberately bred for his role, he'd gone and gotten completely smashed and said a few things he shouldn't have. Things that had spread from there, because his watering hole of choice had not been the secure one whose patrons knew that nothing said in the bar ever left the bar he should have been drinking at. After pulling himself out of his musings and wishing his team luck, Kakashi stepped aside and let them into the classroom where the first phase of the exam was being held, hoping that Sakura would stop flinching every time she got within 10 feet of him sometime soon. His interrogation of her and her parents hadn't been that bad, considering what the T&I department would have done to them if he'd handed them over to them instead of dealing with the situation himself. The Sandaime Hokage groaned and rubbed his temples the second his visitors had left his office. That had been the 3rd group of concerned citizens in as many days to drop by and demand that he separate Uzumaki Naruto and Uchiha Sasuke. The rumors about the Uchiha clan's involvement in the Kyuubi incident, which had died down after the massacre, had risen back up again full force and then some. One of the side effects of these rumors, as well as the odd rumor that Naruto had been deliberately bred for his role that had recently cropped up, was that some people were seeing Naruto as the innocent victim he'd been that day. A number of people who had turned up in his office had come out of actual concern for the boy, concern that they hadn't shown at all over the previous 12.5 years the child had been alive. If only that concern weren't misplaced. According to the psychological profile he'd received just that morning, Uchiha Sasuke would sooner cut his own arm off with a dull blade than seriously harm Naruto. Utate Koharu sat in her usual spot in her favorite bar, the same bar she'd been frequenting since her sensei had still been alive. Rather than taking delicate sips of her drink as she usually did, she was gulping it down and already gesturing for another one. Hers was not going to like this. It seemed that someone had remembered that the Yondaime had taken Kushina out of the village to give birth, and had coupled that memory with the rumors that were flying around the village to create a whole new rumor. According to the new version of events that was going around the village, the Yondaime had gotten wind of the impending Kyuubi attack, and he and a team of ANBU had gone to the Uzumaki residence in the middle of the night and forcefully dragged a heavily pregnant Kushina to a secret location outside the village where they forced her to give birth before she was due. From there, the rather fanciful account grows confused as one version of events has the Uchiha learning of the Yondaime's plan and sending someone to kill the ANBU team and the Sandaime's wife who had served as midwife. And a more romantic version of events has Kushina's husband whose identity was as yet unknown to Konoha's general populace, though there was a great deal of speculation, racing out to rescue his wife, not knowing that the reason she'd been taken had been because the Kyuubi had been about to attack. In a third account that she heard form while she was sitting there downing sake like it was water, which was closely related to the more romantic second account and sounded like the plot for a mediocre romance novel, someone had somehow discovered Kushina's heritage. There was now a romantic story about a Uchiha falling in love with an Uzumaki during a mission to Whirlpool before it fell and dying before they could be wed attached to this tale, and had decided that one of her children would be a perfect vessel for the Kyuubi should the need arise. The person whose identity ranged from the Yondaime to herself had then come up with a plan for dealing with the Kyuubi which involved using said child without telling Kushina, or her husband, lover in this account, which ended with Kushina being dragged screaming from the village while her lover tried to rescue her. While she found the second and third versions of this rumor somewhat amusing, especially her role in them, hers, and hated having his wife mentioned. Hearing that his late wife had been dragged into all this, and placed in the role of a villain at worst, and a rather callous example of a ninja at best would most assuredly send him through the roof. Kabuto frowned as he looked at the Uzumaki boy who had just entered the room. The boy had turned out to be something of a wild card, but, then again, that was something to be expected, considering the fact that the boy had snuck aboard one of the ox carts that had been hired to take his and several other teams to the Chunin exams in Kumo 4 years ago. It had been his first Chunin exam, and one of the Jounin senseis who'd been from a wealthy family and happened to be rather pregnant at the time had refused to hike all the way to the ass-end lightning country, rather than hoofing it, as was traditional in cases where the Chunin exams took place outside Konoha. Konoha's teams had been given a ride which had been followed out of the village with a great deal of jeering and teasing from the more experienced ninja, and a bit of undue fanfare which had caused a number of the village children to run up to them and excitedly send them off. One of the little well-wishers had decided to go on an adventure, it seemed, since he had managed to make his way aboard one of the carts the pregnant Jounin's family had hired during the commotion. It had been at the end of the first day that they'd discovered that they'd had a little stowaway, which said a great deal about the boy's stealth skills, despite the child's current love of over-bright colors. It had been a good thing he'd been there too, considering the fact that one of his teammates had broken his leg while pulling some sort of asinine stunt before they'd left Fire Country, and he and his team would most likely have ended up being forced to turn around and lose a rather choice information-gathering opportunity if there hadn't been a substitute available. An Academy second-year substitute who really should have been back in Konoha. It had been allowed, since Academy students had been signed up for the Chunin exams as a joke before, there being one famous example from 3 decades back where one of the Academy students who had been put in as a prank had ended up completely bypassing the rank of genin. Somehow, in spite of being encumbered with what he'd thought of as deadweight until the kid had caught an opponent in a rather ingenious trap that had been derived from one of the boy's more infamous pranks, they'd made it past the second phase of the exam with said Academy student in tow. He'd quit at that point, but the Uzumaki kid who hadn't yet learned a single jutsu had the crappiest taijutsu he'd ever seen, and absolutely no knowledge of genjutsu or strategy had gone on and gotten himself steamrolled during his first fight in the arena a month later. When he'd encountered the boy again following their return to Konoha, the kid had not known who he was, and had absolutely no memory of the Chunin exams he'd participated in, or even of the fact that such a thing as the Chunin exams actually even existed. Whether or not this had been a result of the rather nasty concussion the boy had received during his bout in the Chunin exams which had left him unconscious for 3 days, or an attempt to prevent the child from trying to run off and take the Chunin exams again, he didn't know. Suffice to say, the boy hadn't made Chunin, so it didn't really matter whether or not Naruto remembered his participation in the exams when he was 8. Now though, Naruto had yet again done something that defied expectations and threw him for a loop. It wasn't so much what he did though, as what he was. Apparently, Naruto had some Uchiha blood in him, and it had been strong enough for him to manifest the Sharingan. This of course was completely strange, as there had been nothing in what little family records were available for the boy to indicate that that would be the case. There were a couple incidences of father unknown in the boy's mother's family tree, but none that seemed like they would be close enough for the Sharingan to crop up. Deciding that he'd spent far too long just staring at the Uzumaki boy who was starting to notice, he headed over to the small group of rookies, hoping to study their reactions to him as he deliberately slipped up in a way a green ninja probably wouldn't notice, as that would tell him a great deal about them, including how observant they are. The carrot he'd be offering them in this case as he gained their confidence as an older mentor figure would be an offer to let them have a peek at his ninja info cards, of which he had several sets. Ino frowned from her perch on Sasuke's back. Rather than yelling at her and calling her Ino pig like she usually did when she encountered her rival in love, Sakura had pretty much ignored the fact that she'd come up to greet her future husband. Her approaching, much less touching Sasuke-kun was something that would normally get a rise out of the other girl, but not today. "Something wrong, forehead?" she asked, seriously worried that there might be something actually wrong with Sakura. "You're not giving up on Sasuke-kun, are you? You can have him," Sakura said, sounding disgusted with the idea of dating the Uchiha. "I heard my parents talking, and apparently, the Uchiha were responsible for the Kyuubi attack." "Yeah, I know," she replied, having heard that enough times when her parents hadn't thought she was listening when she was little. "But it's not like Sasuke-kun did it. He was like a little baby at the time. That's why Dad never says anything to him about his parents, even though he hates them." Sasuke, who'd been standing stiffly as she held on to him, flinched at this, but said nothing. "You knew, and you didn't tell me," Sakura said. "People don't talk about it, just like they don't talk about what happened to the Yukamori clan, or what that Shimura guy's doing on the Hokage's Council of Advisors despite the fact that She started, before she realized what she was saying, and shut up before she said something that could get her killed. There was a lot of things that everyone knew, but never talked about. It was a real surprise when you ran into someone who wasn't in the know, though she probably should have expected it since Sakura was from a family that had started off civilian about a generation or two back, not a clan. "I just still can't see Sasuke the same way I used to though," Sakura said, apparently deciding not to ask what had happened to the ill-fated Yukamori clan who'd run out of money during a particularly nasty winter and refused all charity, even when it got to the point that there was nothing edible in their compound except, or why someone like Shimura Danzo was one of the Hokage's advisors despite the fact that his being such was quite the risk. "But he's Sasuke-kun," Ino exclaimed as she squeezed said boy who had yet to get out from under her for some reason even more tightly. "You might not have lost family in the Kyuubi attack, but I did. And what his family did to Naruto," Sakura started, working up a head of steam until several shinobi appeared in the room. "Settle down, brats," yelled one of her father's colleagues, a scarred man named Morino Ibiki. "Aw damn, and it was just getting interesting," one of the foreign genin muttered. When Ibiki had ordered them to come up and take a test form and a number, she brushed past the gray-haired boy who'd been standing at the edge of her and Sakura's conversation, looking like he was waiting for an opportunity to introduce himself. Seeing as he looked like he was in his late teens, there was a good chance that he was a perv who'd been looking to mentor a rookie during the exams. Her dad had warned her about that sort, and how no matter how nice they seemed, you never went off with them alone. Shuddering over the fact that she'd been that close to the skeevy creep, she grabbed her test and her number and went to find her seat. Hinata smiled sadly when she realized who she would be sitting next to for the written portion of the Chunin exams. She still had a crush on the boy, but she knew that none of her dreams in regards to him could ever come true. He was Uchiha, which placed him in the never in a million years category. It wasn't just that their clans had something of a rivalry going for ages, a mutual antagonism that had picked up in recent days after Sasuke had leveled some shocking allegations against her clan and refused to apologize even after he'd learned that he'd been in the wrong. The Uchiha and the Hyuga had always been like oil and water, or fire and water rather, and this generation, barring Naruto, was no exception. The thing that barred her and Naruto from ever marrying in the future despite the fact that he was of a clan of near equal importance to her own was the fact that the Sharingan and the Byakugan were completely incompatible. Any daughters they might have would have serious eye problems. If they weren't born blind, that was. There was just something about the genes for the Byakugan and the Sharingan that didn't mix properly. She admired Naruto's tenacity, however, his refusal to give up or give in. Knowing the boy's smile was more of a mask than anything, she admired it all the more. She admired it because the boy had the strength to refuse to show anyone that they'd hurt him, that they'd won. She would always admire that. Even though she could never have him, she would do everything she could so Naruto's fire wouldn't go out. "This is all your fault," Sasuke said, making a gesture that took in all of the teams that stood outside training ground 44 waiting for scrolls. Naruto, who had somehow bluffed his way through the test despite the fact that he could have easily used his Sharingan to cheat, had fallen into that old habit of his, which had consisted of yelling at people who were trying to intimidate him. The ridiculous yelling, which Sasuke was half convinced was a bluff, had been so utterly inspirational that everyone who'd heard him had decided not to quit. "How is this my fault?" Naruto growled, just knowing that Sasuke was going to launch into one of his lectures about how a Uchiha was supposed to go about being a Uchiha, which basically boiled down to being a stuck-up snob who didn't let people know they were actually human behind their arrogant facade. "If you behaved like a Uchiha and thought carefully about how and when you speak, we wouldn't have been stuck with so much competition," Sasuke said, apparently starting in on the lecture about how a proper Uchiha was supposed to speak again. "Well, if we'd let all the weak teams weed themselves out, we'd just be facing the really strong ones in there." Naruto replied, deciding to use Sasuke's lecture about how Uchiha is supposed to act like it's all a part of the plan so they don't look unbecomingly blindsided when good fortune randomly drops in their lap against him. You can't possibly have planned that. Sasuke hissed as Team 7 went up to grab their scroll. Naruto just did his best to smile enigmatically, treasuring the brief gobsmacked expression he'd caught before Sasuke had schooled his features into something more properly Uchiha-like. Once the team had their scroll, they picked a gate and waited. When the signal for the second phase to start went off and the Chunin hopefuls had all gone running into the forest, Orochimaru had followed behind a team of children not yet in their teens, waiting for his chance. That chance came, and instead of mice frozen before a snake, he found himself confronted by a pair of would-be manjis. Standing in the forest that day, dodging and weaving around attacks from children who had no hope of defeating him like their older relative had done, Orochimaru had found himself faced with two choices where there had previously been only one. For most of the time he'd been planning this, he'd been planning it with just Sasuke in mind. Then had come the piece of intel that had completely blindsided him, coming out of nowhere when things were just shy of finalized. He had known both Minato and Kushina since Minato was a kid and Kushina a teenager, and neither had shown any signs of Uchiha heritage or any knowledge of such. He didn't know how their child came to have the Sharingan which, to all appearances, was a natural one, and that intrigued him. According to the reports he'd received, the Uzumaki child had improved in leaps and bounds since his graduation from the academy, but he couldn't be certain if that had been a result of the Sharingan or not. The boy was the son of the red-hot-blooded habanero, self-proclaimed victor of 1,000 battles. After all, and Kushina's bragging hadn't been all that exaggerated, and might have even been understated, by the time she died. The former dead last who'd once been nicknamed Tomato had properly blossomed after she'd left the academy, and continued to grow until she'd been forced to retire because she was pregnant with Naruto. Faced with both boys there in front of him, both boys who'd bravely fought despite the fact that they were overwhelmed and outmatched by his skills and power, he found that he had to make a decision that was a much tougher one than he'd thought. He knew what the smart choice was. The smart choice was the one that wasn't the Jinchuriki whose seal he'd been forced to block before the boy who'd been drawing on the Kyuubi's power seriously damaged him. He'd never put one of his cursed seals on a Jinchuriki before, and there was no telling how such a thing would interact or interfere with the seal that kept the Kyuubi contained. Sealing was a tricky art, and things could become exceedingly catastrophic if something went wrong. Far more so than with ninjutsu. The smart choice was naturally the safest choice. The child with whom little could go wrong aside from the Uchiha boy being one of the 90% who didn't survive the sealing because they weren't strong enough to live. Weren't strong enough to become his container. The thing was, Orochimaru didn't do safe. If he'd stuck with safe, he would never have learned anything. If he'd stuck with safe, the young man who now called himself Tenzo would never have happened. A large number of his more fruitful experiments would never have happened. And he would have been stuck stagnating in this village wondering, but never knowing what was possible. He didn't like stagnating, and things that sat still bored him. What use was an eternity where he was bored all the time and nothing changed? Orochimaru found himself with two choices. He went with the interesting one. Sakura sat by Naruto's side, worrying over him as she tried to tend to him using what skills she had, wishing she knew more, that she'd learn more rather than pined over Sasuke. Naruto was so unnaturally still in his sleep so coma-like that she feared he would stop breathing and die while she watched, unable to do anything because she didn't know what to do. This wasn't the first time she'd held back and did little to nothing because she couldn't really do anything. During the mission to Wave, she'd guarded Tazuna because Kakashi had wanted her out of the battle where she would have gotten killed in an instant. During the battle that they had just been in, Sasuke and Naruto had fought, Naruto fiercely trying to protect both her and Sasuke from an opponent who'd had them so outclassed that they might as well have been civilian children. She, however, had mostly hung back, overcome by her fear. She had only just started to care for Naruto now that she'd started seeing him as something more than the idiotic annoyance that had constantly demanded her attention, never once letting up, never once taking a hint. The boy the adults had told her to stay away from, and the teachers had pretty much all called a failure despite the fact that they'd never really given him a chance to succeed. Except for maybe Yumino-sensei, and she wasn't entirely too sure with him. She didn't want to lose that boy, the boy who had never gave up, never gave in, never backed down, even when outmatched and outclassed. But she could lose him soon, forced to watch as he slipped away bit by bit, his mind and his life eaten away by the fever that had started shortly after that creature that couldn't possibly be human had bitten him. Sasuke was alternating between standing guard and coming back to check on Naruto, occasionally shaking him as if to try to get him to stop playing and wake up and be his loud and obnoxious self. She didn't know if the last shreds of Sasuke's obviously frayed sanity would hold if Naruto died. If they didn't, she was probably the first person he would kill for having failed Naruto, and Naruto's attacker would be added to Sasuke's list alongside that brother of his who had killed virtually his and Naruto's entire clan. She didn't know how she could have ever found Sasuke a tragically romantic figure. He was tragic, yes, but studying him, really studying him, rather than sighing over him and swearing that she'd be the one to heal all his hurts with love. She could see that he wasn't anywhere near stable, and about the only things holding him together were Naruto and his quest for vengeance. Watching Naruto lay there so unnaturally still and quiet as a fever ravaged him, and watching Sasuke shake the boy more frantically each time he came to check on him, Sakura had never felt so useless as she had then. Inside his cage within his seal, the Kyuubi studied the new addition to the wall that was just within reach of his paws now that he could push his forelegs through the bars of his cage thanks to his jailer having cracked the seal a bit in wave. He was hindered from doing so now, thanks to what the individual who'd created the new addition to the wall had done to the seal that contained him. But it was only a matter of time before that was fixed since the man's enemies wouldn't let such a thing stand. Interesting, Kurama said as he studied the seal that had appeared and was settling itself into the wall, divining its purpose. Being sealed within a pair of Uzumaki who'd been good with seals had its perks. While the seal was edible now, it was only just that, and it was meant to be the part of something a good bit larger and possibly more tasty than just the seal itself. Many would be surprised that a chakra construct could eat, but he put out energy, and if he didn't take an energy to replace the energy he expended, he would shrink away to nothing. Normally, he had consumed his energy from sources of natural chakra, though he could and would get it elsewhere in a pinch. A pinch such as now when he hadn't eaten in a very long time. Fortunately, he'd learned his lesson after he'd eaten a pair of shinobi to see if they were edible, and corrected the mistakes that had led to a part of him being consumed instead before the two bastards had created a butthole where there previously hadn't been one because there hadn't been a need for one. That lesson would serve him in good stead when the final piece of the seal that had just been placed arrived and tried to take over, serving himself to the Kyuubi, who'd be able to reach him well before he was fully settled, in on a silver platter. Hopefully my dinner won't take too long to arrive, the Kyuubi said as he sat down with a huff in order to wait. One of the things being sealed away had taught the Kyuubi the value of was patience. Naruto twisted in the throes of a high fever and dreamed. He dreamed of the stares and the glares that seemed 100 times colder. He dreamed of the slights against him. He dreamed of standing in a sewer, facing an ancient entity who was sitting, plodding in the dark, tapping his claws against flooded flagstones as it hummed a tune not heard by living ears in more than 5 centuries. "Oh, you're here then," the orange creature said, looking mildly amused. "You're supposed to be stewing in your anger, swearing vengeance, and accepting the seal so you'll be strong. Either that, or fighting to live so you can get back to your loved ones who have been sticking by you and utterly refusing to die. Not sure which really, since either one would work. Considering the fact that you're Uchiha enough to have those damnable eyes, I know which one you'd choose." The creature continued, flicking a tail dismissively. "Pity I can't get at you now and end things before you can try to take control of me like your arrogant bastard progenitors." Naruto wasn't paying attention, however. He'd stopped paying attention at loved ones who have been sticking by you, after a lifetime of loneliness, learning that there were people who were willing to stay. Okay, sadly the chapter is over, and if you enjoyed just leave a like, and subscribe with post notification, so when the next chapter is ready, you will be notified. Okay, see you in the next video. Bye.